Good morning. I'm Jim Dodson. I'm president of Fairbanks Economic Development. We're happy today to bring you this forum on economists speaking out against Ballot Measure 1, or otherwise known as Alaska's Fair Share. We're bringing you this in conjunction with other sponsors, including the Greater Fairbanks Chamber of Commerce, Doyon Ltd, Associated General Contractors, Resource Development Council, Alaska Miners Association, Alaska Sport Industry Alliance, and Alaska Petroleum Joint Crafts Council. All of us are concerned about this initiative. In December of 2019, the Fairbanks Economic Development Board voted to oppose Ballot Measure 1, not because we believe we are experts in taxing the oil industry, but because we believe that a ballot initiative is not the proper way to adjust Alaska's tax regime on the oil industry or any other industry. Today, the forum hopefully will help convince you to vote no on Ballot Measure 1. We have today a list of panelists that are subject experts in their own right. The moderator for this forum is Aaron Schutt. Aaron is the president of Doyon Ltd. He in himself is an expert, but has agreed to be the moderator. So Aaron, I'm turning the floor over to you.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate the chance to be here today. I appreciate the attention of all those that watch this forum online, and in a normal circumstance, we'd all be together in Fairbanks discussing this super important topic. As we know, elections certainly have consequences, and this upcoming election will have many consequences for our state. The outcome of Ballot Measure 1 is among those very important consequences. I wanted to also mention that I'm the chair of the ANCSA Regional Association, which is the 12 regional Native corporations in Alaska. And that organization as well has voted to oppose Ballot Measure 1. You'll see a number of commercials and other public media from the ARA. So I'm here today speaking on behalf of ARA as the moderator of this forum as well. I don't want to take up much time today. I wanted to get right to our panelists who, as Jim said, are economic experts from all over the country and Alaska who know the ins and outs of how Ballot Measure 1 would affect our oil and gas industry. And I'm going to start by reading their introductions, and I'm going to ask each of them to speak for a few minutes. And following that, we'll have a bit of a discussion where I'll probably ask a few questions of each of the panelists, and then we'll have some time for some audience questions that we'll be gathering and posing to our panelists here today. So I'd like to start by introducing Dr. Douglas Holtz-Eakin. He has a distinguished record as an academic, policy advisor, and strategist. Currently, he is the president of the American Action Forum. Most recently was a commissioner on the congressionally chartered Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. He was the 6th director of the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office from 2003 to 2005. Following his tenure at the CBO, Dr. Holtz-Eakin was the director of the Maurice Greenberg Center for Geoeconomic Studies and the Paul A. Volcker Chair in International Economics at the Council on Foreign Relations. During 2007 and 2008, he was the Director of Domestic and Economic Policy for the John McCain presidential campaign. Dr. Holtz-Eakin serves on the boards of the Tax Foundation and National Academy of Social Insurance, and he's also a member of the Aspen Economic Strategy Group. So we'd like to welcome Dr. Holtz-Eakin this morning. And he'll be our first speaker, but I'll introduce our other two panelists here this morning as well. So the next person I'm going to introduce is Jim Calvin. Jim is the Senior Vice President and former principal with the McDowell Group, an Alaska-based research and consulting firm with a team of 20 professionals in offices in Juneau and Anchorage. Jim's specialties include economic impact analyses, cost-benefit studies, market research, and business feasibility studies. He's a lifelong Alaskan and been studying business, industry, and economic conditions in Alaska for 34 years. His formal education includes a Master of Science in Mineral Economics from the University of Alaska Fairbanks and a Bachelor's in Geology from Western Washington University. Our third panelist is Roger Marks. Roger has been a petroleum economist in Alaska since 1979. He originally came here to work for the USGS, designing royalty and bidding systems when the federal oil and gas leasing program on the outer continental shelf was starting up. In 1983, Roger went to work for the state of Alaska Department of Revenue, the tax division, in oil tax design. After 25 years, in 2009, he started his own private practice. One of his clients was the Alaska legislature, where he did oil tax design. He's been involved in most oil tax legislation in Alaska over the last 35 years. In that time, he tried to increase taxes when he thought they were too low and decrease them when he thought they were too high. Of course, he didn't always get his way. None of us do. He has no financial ties to the oil industry, nor does he expect to. So again, I wanted to thank our three panelists for their time this morning, and I'm going to hand over the floor to Dr. Holtz-Eakin.
Well, thank you, Aaron, and thank you, Jim, and the Fairbanks Economic Development Corporation and the other sponsors for having me at this event. I look forward to the conversation with Roger and with Jim, and I want to especially thank Jim and the McDowell Group for their help in the study that AAF put together on Ballot Measure 1. As a bit of background, the American Action Forum is a traditional 501c3 think tank in Washington, D.C., and we try to cover the waterfront of domestic and economic policy issues. And with the arrival of the pandemic and the extraordinarily sharp downturn at the end of the first quarter of 2020, obviously we were trying to track the impacts of this. And one of the real notable impacts was an enormous decline in global demand for oil, and simultaneously with a bit of a price war going on between the Saudis and the Russians, we saw just dramatic upheaval in global oil markets, and futures prices actually going negative for the first time in history. Evelina Chapla, who was one of the co-authors of this study, was following all these developments and was evaluating some of the Trump administration's proposals for bailouts of oil producers, and that was her basic portfolio. And simultaneously, we had enormous distress in the states. State after state was experiencing a sharp drop in revenues when the customers went away. So did the sales taxes, and to some extent the income taxes. And Gordon Gray, who's the other co-author in our study, was taking a look at those issues. And the two became interested in looking at the impact of those states who relied heavily on severance taxes of the recession, and in particular the decline in the price of oil and what it would mean for some of these states. And so they wrote a short study a few months ago on exactly that subject, and became interested and aware of Ballot Measure 1 in the process. So it was with great pleasure that we got a chance to take a look at it in more detail. We're always interested in interesting tax policy problems. We're always interested in what they might say for federal policy as well as the state level policies. And they set out to do this study. And really, the key results are very straightforward. Their estimates are that if you were to implement it as it is currently envisioned, Ballot Measure 1 would cause a decline in investment in oil industry in Alaska, about 14 to 15%, somewhere in there, and that this spillover would produce a job loss of about 6,300 jobs. And this isn't a really surprising result. If one thinks about it, the oil industry is an extraordinarily competitive industry at this point in time, particularly over the past decade. The developments in hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling, the explosion of shale oil on the North American continent, and other international competitors have made this an industry where if you face a higher tax, you're not going to be able to pass that along to customers in higher prices, not easily. So it's going to have to go somewhere else, and that somewhere else is typically returns to shareholders, investments in new wells and in equipment, pay for your workers, and just following the chain of those implications was the bulk of the study. So what we find is that this is a very complicated ballot initiative, but if you dig through it, it appears in its essence to be a sharp rise in the minimum tax, 188% increase in our average estimate. That increase will diminish new drilling of wells and diminish as a result the production and employment prospects for the industry. Oil is clearly a very important industry in Alaska, and the other panelists can elaborate on that better than I can, but this would spill over and cause job losses across the board. And so we think this is a sensible, conservative estimate of the impact of the ballot measure. In doing the research, we tried to look at the published research literature and pick estimates at the center of that, not some extreme version. And I would just say that I think the impacts would probably be bigger than the numbers in the paper, because if you were to do this now, in the midst of the worst and sharpest downturn in U.S. economic history, you would send the signal, I think, to global oil producers that you're pretty indifferent to their prospects in setting up your tax policies, and that's a bad signal to send, and it will probably diminish the investments in Alaska even more than these point estimates suggest. And so we came into this pretty much with no stake other than to try to understand what would happen. It looks like it would have very damaging impacts on the Alaskan economy, and at least to our eye, the irony is that it also doesn't collect near the revenue that the supporters have been advertising, about half as much as they'd say. So Alaska may have very genuine revenue needs, but it seems to me at least that a more broad-based and better tax policy would be a better alternative to this ballot measure. So I really look forward to the discussion and any questions you might have, and thank you for the chance to be here.
Appreciate those opening remarks. Next, I would ask Jim Calvin to offer us his opening remarks.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you to the folks at Fairbanks Economic Development Corporation for the opportunity to join you today. This is a really important subject for the state of Alaska. McDowell Group's been in business for 48 years, and how we're doing as an economy is critically important to all of us. So thank you again. Our role was to provide the benefit of our 20 years of experience in studying Alaska's oil and gas industry, the economic impacts of the oil and gas industry, to Dr. Oppose and his team at the American Action Forum. Every 3 or 4 years for the past 20 years, we've produced very detailed, comprehensive economic impact studies of the oil and gas industry in Alaska. These studies are important because the published data typically doesn't fully inform about the economic impact of the oil and gas industry. The Department of Labor data or Bureau of Economic Analysis data paints a very, very partial picture. To understand the full economic impacts of the oil and gas industry, we typically would gather very detailed purchasing data, vendor data, provided by the oil companies so that we could track spending as it flows through the Alaska economy and measure the jobs and wages that spending creates. So our most recent study was measured economic impact in 2018. And to illustrate how published data fails to do justice to the industry's economic importance, the typical published data would tell you about 10,000 jobs in oil and gas industry in Alaska. After you do the detailed analysis and measure the indirect and induced impacts, we can identify about 42,000 jobs in Alaska that are attributable to oil and gas industry spending in the state. That doesn't include jobs associated with taxes and royalties. That's just jobs associated with oil industry spending on operations, maintenance, and capital projects. That's jobs created all across the state, Anchorage is the state's commercial supply transportation hub, and so about 26,000 of those jobs are in Anchorage. Fairbanks, there's 3,000 jobs that we can point to that are associated with the oil and gas industry. Kenai Peninsula Borough, 4,600 jobs. Matsu, 3,000 jobs, and scattered elsewhere across the state, another 5,000 jobs. So 42,000 jobs and about $3.1 billion in annual wages associated with the oil and gas industry. So it's that detailed knowledge about the economic impact of the industry that we wanted to be sure that Dr. Holzeken and his team had at their disposal as they were considering the economic consequences of ballot measure 1. As I noted, the 42,000 jobs and 3.1 million in wages do not include jobs created as a result of state and local governments spending taxes and royalties that are generated by the oil and gas industry. If you roll that into the mix, by the way, there was about $2.7 billion in taxes and royalties paid by the oil and gas industry in fiscal year 2019. In any case, that spending creates another 36,000 jobs across the economy and $1.7 million in full annual wages. So add all that together, that's 75,000 jobs in Alaska and $4.8 billion in annual wages that are here because of the oil and gas industry in Alaska. That's a quarter of all wage and salary employment in the state. So as Doug noted, his team measured a loss of about over 6,000 jobs associated with ballot measure 1 over time. That's about 15% of the employment that is now created in Alaska as a result of oil and gas industry spending, taxes, royalties, etc. Let me add a little context to that loss. As many of you may know, the state's economy has felt the crushing impacts of the pandemic. We're down about 37,000 jobs in August of 2020 versus August of 2019, including 4,000 jobs in the interior. The oil and gas industry is down about 2,000 jobs from this time now compared to this time last year. So clearly the economy is in bad shape. And one of the windows of opportunity that Alaska has, and particularly has had as it emerged from a dramatic recession that began in late 2014 and continued through 2018, where we lost 12,000 jobs across the state and lost about a third of the oil and gas industry labor force. We were just emerging from that in 2018 and into early 2019 and early 2020. So we have this context where one of the best opportunities for new economic activity in Alaska through willow development or Pika development, that's placed at risk. When we most need that investment, that's placed at risk. So really the timing couldn't be worse, I think, in terms of what this ballot measure might do to the economy when we most need new investment and job preservation and new jobs. We see this ballot measure placing significant risk in one of the areas where we have the greatest potential for economic growth. We will be years in terms of economic recovery in the visitor industry and other aspects of our economy that have been hit particularly hard by the pandemic. Oil and gas industry ballot measure 1 notwithstanding is one of the bright spots that we need to tend to carefully. Again, thank you, Aaron, and thank you to the folks at Fairbanks Economic Development Corporation. I'll look forward to answering any questions that might come up. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Next, we'll ask Roger to give his opening remarks.
Hey, good morning. I usually don't get involved in political processes. In fact, as I like to joke, you could write an encyclopedia about things I know nothing about, but this is something I know a bit about. And as ballot measure 1 was rolled out over the last year, I became incredulous at some of the misleading representations they were making, and that's why I jumped into this. I'm aligned with the group on Alaska. I'm not being paid by them, and as Aaron mentioned, I have no financial ties to the industry. This stuff is complicated and it's confusing, and it's just like if you look out in the world and it looks flat, and it's easy and quick for those who want you to think the world is flat to convince you that it's flat. And it's challenging and takes a bit of time to lay out that while the world looks flat, it is indeed round. This is manifested in several issues, which I'll briefly discuss now. The first issue is the very idea about what fairness is. The sponsors of the Fair Share Initiative would have you believe the state's entitled to 1/3 of gross revenues. This is clearly stated on their website. This drives the terms of the initiative, and it's absurd. Let's look at the first slide here. Gross revenues, by definition, is oil market price less transportation costs. So if price is 60 and transportation is 10, the gross value is 50. That's about what's averaged under SB 21, the current tax. But part of gross revenues include production costs, and costs have averaged about $25 a barrel. That's 50% of gross, and if the state's getting 33%, as the pie chart shows, it doesn't leave much for the taxpayer. So when prices are low or costs are high, production costs take up a big portion of the gross. And in the past, when costs were much lower or prices much higher, getting 1/3 of gross may have been fine. Any reference to historical percentages of gross as a standard for fairness are arbitrary and meaningless. The second issue, why revenues fell after 2014. Let's look at the next slide. State revenues fell after 2014 because oil prices fell. SB 21 went into effect in 2014, about the same time oil markets began to crash. At the same time, costs were rising. This is a net tax. A $1 increase in cost is the same as a $1 decrease in price, and both were happening simultaneous. And this here shows the effect of putting both graphs together. It's the pre-tax profit, the price minus the cost. And in 2016, as you can see, the producers had pre-tax profits of $3 a barrel before paying $8 in severance, royalty, and property tax. Under ballot measure 1, they would pay more. State revenues will have dropped under any tax regime. To blame lower revenues on SB 21 is to misread history. And one of the most egregious representations made by the sponsors has to do with what they say about North Slope oil profitability. And it gets involved in the minutia about how oil and gas accounting works. Most everywhere where oil companies drill a well, they get both oil and natural gas out. But these are two distinct businesses. Oil is a high-value business, gas is a low-value business, but they're produced together, and you cannot allocate costs to one or the other. Per unit profits are reported as a blend, and when you blend, you dilute the value with the oil. In most places, operations are about 50-50 oil and gas. In Alaska, it's 100% oil. And when you look at financial statements, what you're comparing, when you look at the reported per unit profits, it makes the Alaska profits look high. But what you're really looking at is the oil here versus the oil and gas everywhere else. Again, this is the issue where the world looks flat. When you look at this, you can naively conclude Alaska's most profitable place on earth to produce oil, but you're not comparing oil with oil. And again, how could it be? Just look at transportation. In Alaska, it costs $10 a barrel to pipe and ship oil to the West Coast refineries. In Texas, it costs about $1 to pipe oil to refineries in the Corpus Christi area. That's a $9 disadvantage right off the top. Alaska is a remote and hostile work environment. Looking at this slide here from the consulting firm Wood Mackenzie, who has no dog in this fight, they show that Alaska production and transportation costs are $20 a barrel more in the lower 48. But the initiative's whole premise is Alaska is so much more profitable and can pay all this extra tax and still be fine. The initiative is built on this untrue premise based on not understanding basic accounting. The next issue, sponsors say we'll get $1 billion a year from the initiative. Well, that's if oil prices are $75 a barrel. At current prices, we would get a quarter of that, and no one thinks prices are going to be $75 a barrel soon. All this will do is make a small short-term dent in the budget deficit. The next issue, sponsors say the producers paid no severance tax between 2015 and 2019. To get to that result, you have to combine two completely distinct ledgers. If you're looking at this slide here, over this time period, producers quite clearly paid $2 billion in severance tax, and this doesn't include another $9 billion they paid in royalties, property, and income tax, and this is right out of Department of Revenue data. At the same time, non-North Slope producers and small North Slope explorers received $2 billion in credits, and these credits have been phased out. It's as if you paid $10,000 to the IRS and your neighbor got a $10,000 refund. It would not be accurate to say you paid no tax. And ballot measure 1 is directed at the same producers who paid the tax. The next issue, let's talk about the per barrel credit. When SB 21 replaced ACEs, the tax rate was increased from 25% to 35%. If they had stopped there, it would have been a very high tax. So at the same time, they put in progressivity. But instead of increasing the tax rate as prices go up, it started at the high 35% rate and decrease the tax rate as prices go down. And the mechanism they use to decrease the tax rate is the per barrel credit. It's a higher credit at low prices, a lower credit at high prices, and results in progressivity. The per barrel credit does not really function as a credit, it is not a subsidy or a giveaway, and it should not be called a credit. It's as if your IRS tax rate was 20%, but the way you get there is they first tax you at 35% and then give you a credit to get you down to 20%. So what is a suitable standard for tax? Producers have plenty of opportunities outside Alaska. Being competitive is essential for attracting investment. The North Slope was developed subject to market forces, and there's a history here of having taxes above competitive norms. Investment fell, production fell, and in the long term, the state made less money even though it had higher rates. During the ACES tax regime between 2007 and 2013, prices were very high. At the same time, tax rates were very high. Producers were making profits here, but they were making so much more profits everywhere else. Investment fell, and over that time period, production fell 200,000 barrels a day, one of the few places on earth where production fell when oil prices were over $100 a barrel. So looking at this slide here, government take is the percent of pre-tax profits that goes to government. It includes all state and federal taxes and royalties, and it's how economists measure competitiveness. And on this graph here, the bottom axis is price and the left axis is government take. And there are 3 lines here. The bottom line is the take from the average of the lower 48 oil states. I call this a competitive norm. The middle line shows SB 21, the current tax. It's above the norm at high prices and above the norm at low prices and competitive in the middle. And the top line shows ballot measure 1. It's way above the norm at all prices. It's 150 to 350% tax increase depending on price. SB 21 is a sound tax when viewed against reasonable standards of fairness. So in conclusion, you cannot yank hundreds of millions of dollars of cash flow from investors without them modifying their behavior. So how would an uncompetitive tax manifest itself? Producers would have less cash, their projects would become less viable, projects outside Alaska would become relatively more profitable. There'd be incentives to shift investments from high tax to low tax fields, and incentives to keep production low to circumvent the terms of the tax. Oil is a resource whose reserves depend on economic expectations. Without investment, production in existing fields drops very fast. In addition, with all the tax changes we've had here over recent years, the high taxes and the ballot measures, Alaska has a very poor reputation. It's considered one of the least stable physical environments in the world. It's one reason a major North Slope gas line was never built here. It's one reason we have billions and billions of barrels of undiscovered oil on the North Slope and only 2 major companies looking for them. When you hear the Fair and Fair Share Act, be aware it's a loaded term. It's used in a way that makes no economic sense. In my book, the state getting 33% of gross where the taxpayers get 13 is not fair. But more important, investors won't think it's fair either, given what they can get in other places, and they have options. The state has tried the experiment of not being competitive, and it failed. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. So I'm going to ask questions for the next few minutes, and then we'll have some audience questions following that. The first question, and a number of these questions, each of the panelists have addressed in their opening remarks, but I'm going to ask them to be specific in the answer to a couple of these themes. The first one I'd ask Dr. Holtz-Eakin, which is the ballot measure 1 proponents say that passing it will not affect the investment behavior of oil companies. can you give us the perspective from an oil economist about the truth of that statement and how oil companies are likely to react?
It's hard for me to understand that statement. I think Roger's last slide very clearly made the point that the tax structure's not competitive now. An 188% increase in that tax structure, oil producers are going to notice. Literally, as he noted, they will lose millions of dollars in cash flow. That's their bottom line, and they're not going to just take that. They're going to find some way to react to avoid that impact. And the easiest way to react is to go to more profitable opportunities elsewhere. And there are on the globe many other opportunities where extraction costs are lower and transportation costs are lower, and they will also face a less burdensome tax system. So the idea that somehow there would be no reaction, I simply don't understand. They have an obligation to their shareholders to try to go to the most profitable locations. They can be most competitive and get the biggest market share, and help their employees by doing that. They won't simply pay more taxes and then say, okay, we're not going to give it to the shareholders, or we're never going to give a raise to our workers, and we can't invest. That's not a route to economic success for those companies, and they won't do that.
There's a little bit of a follow-up to that question. As you studied this ballot measure, did you encounter any other oil jurisdiction in the world that are considering, either through ballot measure or legislative process, raising oil taxes significantly?
No. In fact, in the work that preceded our work on ballot measure 1, the sort of survey of the severance taxes in the 50 states and the District of Columbia, what you saw was the response to the pandemic was to actually reduce some severance taxes. There were proposals to legislatively or administratively reduce them so as to relieve a burden on the industry that they really just couldn't bear in this moment, because these are, especially you go to April, May, June, the conditions were simply catastrophic for most producers. So this is going completely the other direction from anywhere else we looked at.
Thank you. Next, I'd ask Roger to respond to this question. The vote yes folks talk about how ballot measure 1 only applies to the 3 major fields on the North Slope. That's Prudhoe Bay, Kuparuk, and Alpine. And they say this ring fencing will limit the impact only to those fields. Can you discuss how ring fencing might actually work with regard to oil company investment decision making?
Sure. First of all, let's talk about what ring fencing means. Many places in the world where you as a business, you file a tax return, you have your revenues and have your expenses, and you can deduct your expenses no matter where they come from. And that's what we have here now. If you have ConocoPhillips doing business at Prudhoe Bay and Kuparuk, they have income. And if they're developing the Willow field, they can deduct those. And that becomes very important. It's an issue of timing. When the state went, in 2006, when the state went to a net tax system, we looked very carefully at the issue of ring fencing, and we just, in our modeling, we just saw how valuable it was on a rate of return basis to be able to deduct those costs earlier rather than later. It adds greatly to the net present value and the rate of return of the project. And so if all of a sudden ConocoPhillips has to wait 10 years to deduct their costs from Willow, it makes a huge dent in the economic viability.
Thank you, Roger. I'd ask Jim to address the next question. There's been, in the advertising, kind of from both sides, a lot of discussion about how ballot measure 1 will affect the permanent fund dividend. And can you discuss that for us here?
We can talk in general terms about that, Aaron. I think you just need to keep the big picture in mind. Increasing taxes, reducing the return on investments in Alaska in the oil and gas industry will reduce investment. That ultimately will reduce exploration, development, and production. And it's the royalties from that production that ultimately feed the permanent fund. So while the path may not be direct from ballot measure 1 to weakened dividends, clearly the economic fundamentals suggest that ballot measure 1 will do nothing but reduce the capacity for our permanent fund to generate dividends.
Thank you. Dr. Holtz-Eakin, when you gave your opening remarks, you talked a bit about the COVID-19 pandemic economy. And can you elaborate on how you see ballot measure 1, if it passes in this economy, how that will impact oil company decision making and with regard to investments in Alaska specifically?
Oh, certainly. This is unlike any recession in U.S. economic history. This is not a situation where we had, as in 2008, financial markets collapse and spill over to the Main Street economy. This isn't a 20th century industrial style recession where inventories build up, you lay the workers off, they don't have a paycheck, they cut back in their spending. This was people stopped doing things because of the pandemic. They stopped going out to restaurants, they stopped flying, they stopped engaging in economic activities, and there was just a sharp drop in household spending, the sharpest drop on recorded history. It was just incredibly abrupt, and the things that they stopped doing mostly were drive and travel and all of the things that generated demand for petroleum products. They also then spilled over into broader manufacturing and other economic activities that demand those products and chemical production. And so we saw this massive decline in the global demand for oil. And in that moment, you have enough problems. And if it is exacerbated by making your cost structure suddenly uncompetitive, you are going to have the global problem of the pandemic and the unique Alaska problem of an uncompetitive tax structure. That's just really going to be hard to combat. And the solution will be to get rid of the unique Alaska problem with the tax structure and shift activity elsewhere. That's the only sensible response for those producers. And I don't have the history the other panelists have, but it strikes me that this is not the reputation you want to get. We get the worst downturn in recorded history in the second quarter, and the response is to make the economic environment even more unpleasant and unattractive with this ballot measure. So it strikes me as bad timing to do it and bad policy in the midst of a very serious recession.
Thank you. If I could add a little bit of editorial comment for the Alaska perspective on the kind of the dramatic change in demand for oil. So in Alaska, I think Alaskans know a little bit about how much we produce. You can roughly call it 500,000 barrels a day. The US just prior to the pandemic was about 12 million barrels a day of production. The world was just over 100 million barrels of oil production per day. So we were 0.5% Alaska's market share of the world oil production, about 0.5%, about 5% of US domestic production roughly. And the world demand crashed 25-30%. Is that right, Dr. Eakin? It was a huge crash in oil demand. So it was, 50 times Alaska's daily production was the change in the world oil market. And so that's kind of some perspective for Alaskans. They consider this how our tax policy making us less competitive in that environment where we're such a small player in the US and the world stage really shows the opportunity for major companies to invest elsewhere if we look unattractive. Next, I wanted to ask Roger to elaborate about the 4 sources of oil income that Alaska's state government gets. So this ballot measure affects only the severance tax or production tax, but there are also several other sources that the ballot measure 1 proponents like to ignore when they're talking about the effects on our state government and our revenue streams.
Right. There's, we call it sort of 4 bites at the apple here. There's the production tax, and that's what ballot measure 1 addresses. But the other sources we get, and the most significant, is royalties. And you know, I put that government take slide up there, and what government take does, one important thing it does is look at how much is being paid to the government in all forms, not just the production tax, but everything. And the royalty in Alaska is a particularly onerous beast for a number of reasons. The royal, if you can put up my first slide with the pie chart, but maybe you remember that. You know, we talked about the gross revenues and the net revenues. You know, at $60 oil, the gross revenue was 50. Well, you pay royalties on roughly 1/8 of the $50. Even though $25 is what you're paying out in cost, you're actually paying 1/8 of that. And when you get in a situation where here you go. So you get in a situation where costs, you know, where costs are low, or in Alaska prices are high, that 1/8 royalty takes a huge bite out of the your pre-tax profits. And that's why you know, the ballot measure 1 is talking about how Texas has a 30% royalty and ours is only 1/8. Well, if you do the arithmetic with a 1/8 royalty based on our reduced value and our higher costs, with the Texas producers walk away with a lot more money than paying that 30% royalty than they get here. In addition, there's property tax. You know, property tax is about $3 a barrel. It's $3 a barrel where the price of oil is $10 and where it's $100. And it's a very regressive tax because the more you spend, the more something costs, the more it's assessed value. And then there's state corporate income tax, which is 9.4%. So that's one reason government take looks at everything that's paid to government, because you just look at just one tax by itself, it misses a big part of the big picture.
Can you tell us where Alaska falls in regard to total government take currently, and what it would be if the ballot measure passes?
Well, look at, I can pull my last slide up here. With the government take, and we put that up, the 5th slide. See the 5th. Next slide. Can you get the next slide there? Basically what that slide shows. The next slide with the last slide. Yeah, what it shows, right now prices are you know, $40 a barrel, and the government take is you know, about 95% under currently. So that means, you know, of the pre-tax revenue, 95% is being paid to the government in one of those 4 forms, and under the ballot measure, it goes over 100% at current prices.
Thank you, Roger. Jim, one of the ballot measure provisions that doesn't get as much discussion is the so-called transparency provision, where the various information that oil companies have to provide to the state currently would become public documents. Can you explain that provision a bit and talk about what you think Alaska businesses and the oil companies, how that would affect their business decision making?
You know, I can't speak to that in any particular detail, other than noting that it's a competitive landscape, whether it's oil and gas industry or the seafood industry or tourism, and it certainly does nothing to enhance Alaska's competitive position if producers and others are required to publish proprietary data. So beyond that, Aaron, I don't have any particular insight into that particular aspect of the ballot measure.
Thanks, Jim. Maybe I'll offer just a bit of insight. This was one of the provisions that caused Doyon Ltd to formally oppose the ballot measure, because as a contractor through Doyon Drilling and our other oil field subsidiaries, all of our contract information would become public for any work we do at Alpine or Park or Prudhoe Bay. Unlike many participants in Alaska's oil and gas industry that are international companies, we serve only one market. This would destroy any competitive advantage we have in that market, because our competitors could all see our rates, our contract structures, all sorts of information that I'd love to know about all of our competitors. And that would also be true for a number of small businesses in Alaska that serve the major producers. And sometimes people don't think about that when they think about who provides services. There are plenty of small contractors, whether they're providing all sorts of services, engineering, security, food service, all these different business lines where that information would all of a sudden become public. So it's a really important provision that doesn't get a lot of discussion in the public forums about this ballot measure. Doug, I'd ask you to address the next question. We're not getting a lot of questions online, so I'm going to keep asking questions through the hour here until we get other questions. The next question I wanted to ask you about the time frame of investment decisions that oil companies might make from, when they sanction a project to when that project might actually go into production and produce tax revenue and other things for the state, and how that plays into this ballot measure and the arguments that SB 21 failed because we haven't had 1 million barrels a day produced in the last few years.
Well, I mean, obviously, this is a long-term investment decision, and when you're looking at planning horizons that aren't a year, that are measured in decades in some cases, you have to be cognizant of the uncertainty that comes out of sort of having ballot measures as the way you do policy. That's something a company's going to think about. It's also going to affect the competitive landscape in this case, because the timing down on the lower 48 is very different. The real change that happened over the past decade with the fracking revolution is you can actually move much more quickly as a producer in the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania, where I grew up, than is possible on the North Slope. And so, this feeds into some competitive issues that Alaska was facing anyway. And if you've got a choice between the two, you know what producers are going to do. They're going to have to do the rational thing and move investment locations so that they can reduce their uncertainty, have a more competitive tax structure over the horizons that they know something about. And that, I think, is a really serious issue at the moment.
Thank you. Roger, last week, the Vote Yes proponents posted an analysis on their website. Have you had a chance to look at that? If you have, can you comment on what they posted?
Analysis of what?
Of the ballot measure.
Yeah, I guess I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to.
The work that the Vote Yes folks posted last week.
Oh, that was, yeah. So, right, one concern about the ballot measure is there's been no modeling of the investment, what the investment response might be here. They said it won't affect investment. They have no modeling results to show this. After last week, after over a year, they released some analysis that one of their participants did. Someone named Ken Alper, he used to be head of the tax division. He's not an economist. He knows how to compute the taxes. And what that analysis pretty much consisted of is just taking an Excel sheet and switching one tax input for another, and showing the results. The ballot measures, the people have said there were 15 people worked on this measure and did the analysis, and they've said all of them want to remain anonymous. That's what they said, all of them. And so, it's easy. This just reinforces the problem with the initiative. I mean, just sort of get into the technical minutia a little bit. I talked about how the per barrel credit works and how it's part of the progressivity. And without the per barrel credit, the tax rate's pretty high. I mean, basically, the main thing ballot measure 1 is, again, when SB 21 replaced STACES, they took the tax rate increase from 25% to 35%, but put in the per barrel credit for progressivity. The main thing ballot measure 1 is, they just take away the per barrel credit and keep the high 35% rate. In my judgment, that's possibly the most haphazard tax design in history. It's not serious tax design, and just sort of underscores the problem of this process of a few people sitting behind closed doors, basically playing with an Excel sheet and go, wow, we can change this to this and look at how much extra money we get, and that's without really getting into the depth of what might happen.
Aaron, can I say a word about that?
Sure, please do.
So, step back and get the big picture. This is something I find frustrating about public policy debates, not just this one, but this is intended to be a tax increase. No one's confused about that. So they're taking money that the companies otherwise would have. Okay, how can the company recover from that? Can they charge higher prices to buyers of oil? No, they're in a very competitive landscape, and they're not going to be able to do that. So that's not going to happen. Okay, they could maybe stop paying dividends and offer a low rate of return to their investors. Well, I'm going to take ConocoPhillips right out of my portfolio and go buy Tesla or something exciting, but they can't do that either. They won't be able to raise capital. Okay, so how can they preserve their investment and have it be unaffected? Well, they could stop paying their workers. So they could have big layoffs, or they could cut wages, or do something draconian enough to preserve their investment plans. That's just implausible that that's what would happen. You need both capital and labor to operate things. So it's not like you have the right spreadsheet or not. You've asked the impossible to happen if you want to impose a large increase like this and say there's going to be no reaction.
Thank you. So we do have an audience question. Someone wanted to go back and talk a little bit more about the ring fencing issue and explain, could we explain how that actually works with regard to deducting costs from an investment in a field that's not one of the 3 legacy fields, and kind of the mechanics of that, I think, is the question of the ring fencing concept.
Sure, want me to take that one?
Sure, Roger, why don't you please?
So yeah, I probably didn't explain this very well the last go around, but what ring fencing means, I mean, right now we have a situation we're not ring fenced. And so, you look at the North Slope as an entire business entity, and so ConocoPhillips can they can take their they can offset their Prudhoe Bay profits with their costs for developing Willow. What the ballot measure does is put in ring fencing where every field is its own business entity to itself. And when you have something like Willow that has no income, you would have to just defer deducting those costs until that time where it starts producing oil and it has enough revenue to deduct it. And again, in terms of the economics of it, it's just a timing thing. You get to deduct those costs sooner or later. But in terms of the net present value and the time value of money and the rate of return, it just makes a project a lot more viable if you can monetize those upfront costs sooner rather than later. I hope that makes it clearer.
Thanks, Roger. I'm going to ask Jim to address the next question, which is similar to the comments ballot measure 1 proponents say it won't affect investment decisions. They also claim that the ballot measure will create 10,000 jobs. Can you respond to that claim?
Well, it's hard to understand where that reasoning might come from. I would suppose that they would be thinking that there would be an increase in tax and royalty payments flowing to state government. That money would be spent on capital projects, basic state operations, and other forms of government employment. I think the 10,000 job number is based on the assumption that there'd be $1 billion in new revenue created. The analysis conducted by Dr. Holt Eakin and his team suggests that it might be closer to $200 million. So at face value, the math is incorrect. But I think it's also important to note that it's the oil and gas industry and other basic industries such as commercial fishing, the visitor industry that bring new money into Alaska's economy and support government operations, whether state or local. So you have to have a healthy basic industry. You have to have a healthy oil and gas industry for there to be resources to provide essential public services. So ultimately, if you tax your basic industries into a non-competitive position, ultimately you shoot yourself in the foot and you'll see a decline in revenues that are needed to support state and local government.
Thank you, Jim. So we've almost gotten to the end of the hour. I'm going to thank our three panelists for their presentations and answering my questions here today. I think it's very clear from their analysis and published work that the ballot measure will have very significant negative impacts on our most important private industry in the state. It'll have impacts on thousands of jobs for Alaskans, including many in interior Alaska. And for those reasons, Doyon, the ARA, and many other organizations have chosen to oppose ballot measure 1, and we're going to ask those people who are joining us for this discussion this morning to join us in voting no. Some of you may have already, as mail-in ballots have already gone out and are being returned. For the rest of us who are going to vote in person early or in person on November 3rd, we'd urge you to vote no. So next, I'd hand this back to Jim Dodson. And again, thank you for your time and attention today as we discuss this important issue.
Thank you, Aaron. Great job. Roger, Doug, Jim, we really appreciate your time and your knowledge. Obviously, this is an important issue to Alaska. It's difficult to understand why somebody would want to raise taxes in a time of a severe economic crisis. COVID-19, really has brought that on Alaska and other parts of the country. But even if we didn't have COVID-19, I think from the presentation today, it's easy to understand that this initiative is a bad way to change public policy like taxation. So hopefully all of you will take this knowledge and distribute it to your friends, talk to others, and please join us voting no on ballot measure 1. Thank you for your time today, and thank you for participating in Alaska's election.
We are clear.